Alright guys, and welcome to another video. Today we're going to be answering one very simple question. What is the best DPS class in TBC Classic? And we're going to be doing it in a tier list format since everyone loves tier lists. This will probably be a much faster video because I've already done a tier list for classes in a general format, but now we're going to specifically look at different individual specs for every single class. I'm not going to talk about every single spec though, because a lot of specs you don't really see them in a PvE environment that much, and they're more of a PvP spec. If you want to help the channel guys, please consider subscribing and liking the video because that really does help out and you won't miss my future live streams. Anyway, let's jump into the meat and the potatoes of this video. So let's talk about the Fire Mage first. Fire Mage has a solid spot in A tier for the majority of TBC, so most people tend to spec into Fire Spec when they've got a decent amount of crit gear so that they can get those ignite procs off very frequently and do really good damage. However, until then, mages like to dabble in Arcane and Frost Spec, normally when TBC just launches. But here's the thing guys, a lot of people are going to be jumping into TBC with tier 3 gear, so they probably will have a lot of hit chance and crit chance, so we probably won't see Arcane and Frost being used that much. However, Arcane becomes a really solid A tier class again in tier 5 when you get a particular set bonus that increases the damage of Arcane Blast. So overall, Mage are in the A tier, but all I'm going to say is Frost Spec is slightly worse than Fire and Arcane specs. But then it's also very useful in dungeons, so that's why I consider Mage overall to just be very snugly in tier A. Now let's move on to the Warlock. Warlock has a very strong snug spot in tier S. They are definitely the highest DPS on single target boss fights and AoE situations throughout the entirety of TBC, and arguably the strongest class in the game. A lot of people will be playing Warlock and a lot of people will be stacking Warlocks in raids because they're just so ridiculously powerful and they don't even need that much gear to be incredibly powerful. They just need to get there, well, at least close to the spell hit cap, throw them in a group of an elemental shaman and they absolutely pump. Next we have the Affliction spec. I'm going to put Affliction in tier B. So I've got a video coming out, well, you've probably already seen the video actually if you watched the video yesterday about Affliction. They are much more of a support class, primarily a tank support class, and they are very useful in a raid, but they aren't absolutely god tier when it comes to DPS when you compare them to a Mage or a Destruction Warlock. However, I have seen some people play Affliction Warlock and they do incredibly big DPS in Affliction spec, so I think in the hands of the right player, Affliction can bump up and have a sneaky spot in tier A, but you know, you have to be fairly skilled and know exactly what you're doing to bump up to tier A. For the majority of people, you are probably going to be in tier B. I mean, there's always wiggle room with these tiers depending on, obviously, subjective opinions of everyone watching the video and depending on the skill of each individual player. Now let's move on to talking about the Warrior. So I'll just use one icon for Warrior since, you know, both specs are fairly equal and really good. Now the Warrior moves around the tiers depending on what phase of the game you are playing, you know, what patch you are playing, what content you are clearing, because when Warriors start to get better and better gear, they start to pump more and more damage. So at the beginning of the expansion, they're fair enough, they are going to start in tier C, you know, and it is just pure scaling. That's the reason why. But in the hands of a good player, you can see Warriors get pretty high in the meters, even in tier 4 to be honest. But in tier 5, they start pumping up into tier B, and then in the, you know, when you're starting to get into Battle for Might and Hyjal, Black Temple, that's when they pump up even higher to tier A. So I would argue that they just pump up each tier when every new patch comes out. And obviously especially when a Warrior is lucky enough to get the Warglaives. And while we're talking about Warrior, we may as well talk about the Rogue because it's the exact same story. It is combat spec by the way. So yeah, they start in tier C, but as the expansion progresses on and on, they just bump up the tiers until they're eventually in a snug spot in tier A by the time tier 6 rocks up. There are other specs that you can play as a Rogue in a PvE environment, but they are more tailored for PvP. Don't need to talk about them that much, but they're essentially just a tier behind that combat spec. because you can play Mutilate spec, and there is a Subtlety spec that you can play too. Just easy way to explain it, they're just a tier behind combat spec. Now let's talk about the Retribution Paladin. Ret Paladin has a very snug spot in tier B. They only become an absolute god class in Wrath of the Lich King, but it's still nonetheless, like the Affliction Warlock, a really strong support class. Your primary role as a Retribution Paladin isn't to top meters, it's to support the raid with everything that you bring to a raid, and your spot is more than justified, despite the fact you're doing slightly less DPS than the other DPS. Let's talk about the Hunter now. Very clear, strong spot in tier S. The Hunter is, again, just same story as the Warlock really, the absolute gods when it comes to DPS in TBC. And they will obviously be playing a Beast Mastery spec, but there is also a little bit of a place for the Survival spec. Again, it is a support class, and it belongs in tier B with all the other support DPSs. Although, again, in the right hands, Survival Hunter can actually do some really serious damage. I've seen it happen before, and I would honestly bump them up to tier A, but they have to be in the hands of the right player. For the majority of players who are giving Survival a spin, they'll probably be in tier B. And the same goes for Marksman. It's just a tier behind, really. You don't really see Marksman Hunters that much. It's all about Beast Mastery Hunters and the occasional rare Survival Hunter. So next we have a Shadow Priest. Shadow Priest gets a good spot in tier B. Again, not the absolute best DPS in the game, however, they provide an immense amount of support for the entire raid, and are actually in really high demand despite the fact they're more of a tier B class when it comes to DPS. You know, every raid wants at least 2 Shadow Priests, because just because they're so ridiculously useful at benefiting all the other DPS and the healers and even the tanks a little bit. Shadow Priest will out DPS Warriors and Rogues in tier 4 and 5, but towards the end of tier 5 and tier 6, then Warriors and Rogues will take over. That's why they're a higher tier, and that's why I have to put Shadow Priest in a lower tier, because we are purely talking about DPS in this video rather than support stuff. Now let's do the Shaman. So Elemental, very snug spot in tier A, especially, in fact, to be honest, you could even argue that they're more tier S when you're in like tier 4 and a little bit tier 5, because the unfortunate story with the Elemental Shaman is they don't scale very well, but for some reason they do insane damage when TBC launches. So in the first tier, you know, doing Karazhan Gruels and everything like that, yeah, it'd probably be top S tier, to be honest, especially when you consider all the support that they provide. But they come down a tier, in all honesty, in the later phases of the expansion. Now, for the enhancement spec, it's just the same story as all the other support classes. They don't do the best DPS in the world, and that's why they are in tier B. And lastly, we have the Druid. So first of all, Feral Druid, very snug spot in tier A. So for some reason, Feral Druids just do ridiculous damage in TBC, and they also provide an immense amount of support for the raid too, so they're a really strong class to bring, and they can very quickly and easily swap between tanking and DPS, so they're very useful to a raid. But yeah, if we're talking about pure DPS, they are actually a tier A class. Then we have the Balanced Druid. Balanced Druid comes more into tier B, but it can cross over into tier A, again in the hands of the right player, and when you have the really good gear. I mean, there is a guy at the moment on Karazhan who does stream and he plays a Boomkin, and I would put that guy in tier A because he does ridiculously high damage. And that's pretty much it, guys. Obviously there are more niche specs out there like Demonology Warlock, Smite Priest, Marksman Hunter and Mutilate Rogue like we mentioned before. They're just probably all going to go into tier C. But again, in the hands of the right player, who knows? They may end up being a much more of a top tier class. There's a lot of wiggle room and a lot of juice left in the tank when it comes to TBC theory crafting, in my opinion. I've been hearing some interesting things about really weird niche specs like Demonology Warlock, Fire Warlock and all of these kind of things. So who knows what the future will hold. But anyway, my name is MetaGoblin. Until my next video, ciao.